Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this session of LitFest X. We are joined by Dinesh C. Sharma, who is a renowned journalist with over 30 years of experience. And his primary work has been writing on science, technology, and innovation. This is, I believe, his second book called The Outsourcer, The Story of India's IT Revolution. Dinesh, welcome to LitFest X.
Thank you, Kumar. And first of all, let me congratulate you on this virtual Lit Fest because I think it's an experiment of its own kind. And it's nice that we are discussing digitally India Digital on the first virtual Lit Fest. And I'm sure you would have got a taste of the digital connectivity, interviewing so many people live for different broadband and bandwidth connections. So it must have been quite an experiment in itself.
Absolutely. I was joking with one of the speakers, I think yesterday, who was joining us from the US. And I said, the connectivity and the broadband experience between the US and India is far clearer and smoother than what I have experienced even between two people in the same city. So but that's ironic. But that's the sort of broadband story in India as far as we are concerned right now.
That's right. In fact, it's a long way we have come to this stage. I think what we are doing today would not have been possible, say, even 10 years back, or I belong to a generation which had seen even worse. And getting a normal telephone line, one had to, say, there was a waiting list. So, I mean, things have changed. So, that's in part the story which I have been wanting to tell through this book.
Right. About the book, the story of India's IT revolution. From what era have you sort of chronicled this IT revolution in India?
No, in fact, it's a very interesting story because when I started researching and got interested in doing a book on information technology revolution in India, and I've been a journalist since 1984, and most of this period from then till now, I have covered IT in a big way, right from the days when the companies were smaller and things were just taking shape. The new computer policy had just come in through all that era. So I found that yes, there was a story to tell because one has never seen any technology or any sector changing so rapidly in one's own lifetime. So I wanted to do that, tell the bigger story from what I've been writing on a day-to-day basis. So when I started doing that, I thought, let me start with the time when IBM had to leave India. That was in 1977, because that story I had heard from number of people since it was still very fresh in the 80s, and I used to hear it about it a lot. And ultimately, towards the end of 80s and early 90s, in fact, in 92, IBM came back. So I thought, let me start the story from the time when IBM left India and to the time they have come back, say in the mid 90s, or the story of liberalization. But when I started researching the thing, then I thought the story should begin much earlier because once, I mean, I can't just randomly pick a point saying that, okay, this day, that is in 1978, IBM left the country, but I have to look into it. When did they come and what were they doing all this time? So in fact, then the story goes back. And when I started looking at that period, so actually I had to really look into independence time, that is 1947, and in fact a few years before that. So the first myth that which I broke, which I had and I had to break myself, that IT was a thing of the 80s and 90s. So that myth was broken while I started researching. So the span of my book is really 60 years. So I can say that starting from the day the India got independent. And one has to place it in the larger context of science and technology development in India, which really began in 1947.
That's a really interesting insight, Dinesh, because clearly, many generations after we we assume that the Indian IT growth story or the IT revolution is really a phenomena of the last maybe 25 or at best 30 years, not longer.
Yeah,
And but yes, you're right. You have researched it from a time when we are also talking about the big bulky computers or computing devices,
yeah,
which clearly our generation has not even seen in India. So that is one of the myths that you have sort of broken in the book. What are some of the other sort of myths or revelations that you have
yeah.
come out with, in your research and portrayal in the book?
Right. In fact, there are several such things that, the whole story people say started during the Rajiv Gandhi period, that is the 1980s, when
Yeah,
we had the new computer policies and several projects were started. For example, railway reservation started during that time. On people attribute the growth to the 1991 liberalization policies. And the third point people say is the Y2K problem, year 2000 problem, when a lot of American companies came to Indian companies to repair the software which they had been using and which didn't have the date for 2000, which had the date for 2000 as 00. So these are two, 3 points which people often talk, but yeah, they are all important inflection points in the journey. But as I said, the journey begins much before that, because if you are really looking at this industry as a phenomena of the 90s, one can say that yes, exponential growth was seen in the 90s post liberalization, but the ground for doing that, ground for reaching a stage where companies could become really big, was laid much before, even I would say 60s to 70s, because we have to look at the number of factors that contributed. It is the government policies, the availability of higher technical education institutions, the demand for talent, or the shortage of manpower in the Western companies, and of course the entrepreneurial spirit of the people who came into this field. So there have been several factors which have contributed, and at various points, I would say that different sets of people, policies, and companies came together, and that made it really happen. So yes, of course, we have seen in the 80s. I would say the turnover would have been say $100 million, the export turnover, and it reached $100 billion in a couple of years back. So that 30-year period, yes, we did grow a lot, but the foundations were laid in 60s and 70s really. And the presence of multinational companies prior to, in fact, when I look at the IBM story, it was a mixed bag, I would say, because as you mentioned, it was an era of computing devices rather than, data processing devices rather than computers or information technology, because it was a hardware driven sector in the 60s or even the 50s, because you had the unit record machines where calculations were done in different sets of machines. Then you had data processing machines. Then you came mainframe computers and mini computers. So all these epochs were there between say 50s and 70s or late 70s. And at every point, there were people working in India. In fact, railways was one of the largest users of data processing machines. Jute mills were using in 60s and 70s, and IBM was supplying all those mainframes. So Indians were involved in working in those machines. In fact, IBM had one of the largest training programs in the country, and in fact, they sensitized a lot of government departments, ministries, and academic institutions towards the use of computers. So they had a role. In fact, they had to leave because of a different set of problems, which we can discuss later, including foreign exchange and the desire of Indian government to be self-reliant. But the presence of multinational companies in the period 60s to 70s did really help in developing the skills. How did the core issue which I have tried to address is how did Indians learn to write software?
Right. You mentioned something very interesting about how we believe that the IT revolution came as a byproduct of the 1991 liberalization, or that it really took off in the Rajiv Gandhi administration.
Yes,
Um,
sir.
in terms of the new research, and like you mentioned, how Indians really took to developing software writing skills. How did we become this big, massive army of coders?
Yes.
I mean, clearly there was a generation where people were probably not studying computer sciences or computer engineering. They were either doing chemical engineering, mechanical engineering, so on and so forth. And suddenly, what happened? How did we suddenly become great at coding, and how did so many of us started to code?
Yeah, it's an interesting study, I would say. And what my research shows, and which I have detailed in the book, is a key part of this whole story. It has to be seen in the framework of science and technology development in India, which really begins at the dawn of independence in this country. And in fact, a few years before, there was a national planning committee in the Congress, which after it took the shape of planning commission, and that was a time when Nehru had great interactions with several leading scientists, including Bhabha, Mahalanobis, Bhatnagar, a whole bunch of scientists, Moshkunda Vishwesharaya, Meghnad Saha. So these people sat together. There were formal meetings, there were formal reports on. They imagined an India, how it will be after it gained freedom. So one key element of this alliance between Nehru and other politicians and scientists was that they wanted to invest heavily into science and technology, along with building dams and bridges, and improving basic infrastructure like irrigation, agriculture, and all that. One key element of science, Nehru's policy after independence, was that India should go ahead and invest heavily into science and technology. So that brought into focus, because right after independence, we had the Department of Atomic Energy coming up. Already the Indian Statistical Institute was there in Calcutta, which was doing a lot of computing relating statistic related work under Mahalanobis. So they were the two key advisors, science advisors, I would say, of Nehru. And both of them needed computers for their own work. For example, Mahalanobis needed it for statistical work, doing national sample surveys, and Bhabha needed it for to develop reactor. So then they started developing their own computers, and that's how these groups became big. And Department of Atomic Energy became a hub for computer development. They got a bigger computer from CDC in US, Control Data Corporation. So they were not using computers only for their work. Then that became a national computer center. So people from all other countries, I mean, all other institutions could come and use. So, and they were also training people. So that's how the initial skills were developed. So first they did their own computers. They did develop from whatever material they could do, and people were trained in America. They came back. So all that helped in developing the initial skills to interaction with foreign companies by doing things on their own. For example, IIT Kanpur had it was a result of an Indo-American project. The whole setting up of IIT was based on a project which India and America did. So for 10 years we had American professors coming and staying in IIT Kanpur, and one of the key departments which they developed was the computer science and engineering department, and computers were brought in from America. And in fact, since you mentioned that they were so bulky and heavy, and in fact they all came in chartered planes. So the plane landed at the Air Force Station in Kanpur, and when Tata Institute of Fundamental Research in Bombay and the Baba got Pan Am chartered flight, brought the computer. So that was an era. So these people really seeded, and when he's out of the Department of Atomic Energy and TIFR grew the ECIL in Hyderabad, that is the Electronic Corporation of India Limited, which built mainframe and mini computers. And then out of that came out the National Center for Software Technology in Bombay. So these were the elements. And Department of Electronics came out of the Bhabha School of Atomic Energy, and that became a nucleus for NIC. So a whole lot of institutional development took place because of the scientific, the interest taken by scientists at that time. And of course, commercial computing was being promoted by IBM in a big way. So all these different factors, the founding of IITs, and in fact, we can discuss it further if you wish. if we have time. So all this, that's a combination of factors, I would say.
Right. You know, it's a very often quoted statement by people that the IT sector did well in India because the government didn't get involved, because there was no, trade unionization allowed, so on and so forth. Is that really true? I mean, you've done a lot of research for
Yeah.
this book. Is that really true?
No, part of the statement is true because Devang Mehta was a good friend of mine and I used to interact with him. And he had famously said that in mid 90s, I think, that India is doing well in beauty contests because that was the first time Miss World and Miss Universe came out, two, three in succession. And in the software industry, because the government has nothing to do with both of them. He was exaggerating, I think, and the industry, of course, would like you to believe that it grew despite the government, but that's not true because one of the major contribution came in the form of the policies in the 80s, the new computer policy. See, 70s was a period of restriction when really, you could not even import a computer and there were a whole lot of delays in getting a computer system installed. So if you wanted a computer yourself, you had to go to the government and tell them that we want this. So they would decide which system you would buy. So it was, the 70s was a bad period in terms of the economic and industrial environment of the country. It was not just the computing industry that suffered, the whole industry suffered because of the socialist policies and the approach which we took. Imagine, can you imagine that, we had a ceiling on the production. I mean, government would like you to produce more or export more, but there was a ceiling on production, ceiling on exports. All those restrictions were there. But in the 80s, things started changing. And in fact, the role of government changed from regulator to facilitator to a collaborator, I would say, in the 90s. So the role of state has been very heavy in terms of creating conditions in which the industry can grow. For example, IITs were created, the Department of Electronics, set up special courses in computer applications. So that created a lot of a manpower pool. And then you had these programs for banking computerization, something called class, introduction of computers in class. So all this led to demand creation. And also simultaneously the efforts to facilitate exports were there. But the biggest impetus to software industry came in the form of software technology parks. That was a single window scheme under which smaller companies which could not afford to have a direct data link. In fact, data link sort of broke the whole thing of lack of infrastructure companies could overcome because they did not need they would not need the airports and ports to do software export business. For the first time, you could export something out of India sitting in your office through data links. But data links could not be afforded by every company. The companies were very small. In fact, Infosys, when they started, they didn't even have their own computer to begin with. So people had to use the computer of clients. If somebody wanted the software to be developed, you had to go to their office and do the work there. So that's how initially all the companies started their work. They were pretty small. So they could not afford a data link. Like Texas Instrument was an American company, so they could come and set up a data link from Bangalore to their offices in US. So they demonstrated that how it can be done. But smaller companies could not afford. In fact, bigger ones could not afford at that time. So what the government decided, they thought of this scheme called Software Technology Park, where a satellite data link could be set up, and a lot of companies could come up in a cluster and they could use it, and also they did not have to go to different departments to get licenses. So that was, I think, a major inflection point in the exponential growth. And then the other liberalization policies, the tariff policies coming down and all that helped. But in terms of sheer, push from the government, it came in the form of software technology park scheme. It did take some time for implement because, see, even if one government department says something, Department of Electronics was very progressive in its thought, but there were other ministries which are creating stumbling blocks. So that took some time, but it really picked up after that. I think that was a really major turning point, I would say, the software technology park scheme.
Right. There has been obviously a lot of political backlash with, from countries like the US, with respect to H-1B visas, etc. And, in some ways they are trying to implement some amount of protectionism for software jobs in the US on home turf. And also, we've seen because of the global sort of recessionary phase that Indian companies, which have been overly dependent on US, UK, and European customers for revenue, have clearly not been able to develop a strong sort of revenue base within the domestic market. Um, do you see that mix changing dramatically between domestic and sort of offshore revenues soon?
Yeah, it is changing, but I won't say it is changing dramatically. But in the past, say 10 years, if you see the domestic demand has grown up, has gone up substantially and it is going up. So it is working both ways. First of all, the companies will have to, and they are realizing that, the external environment is changing. So that when you are into an export market, there are several factors which come into the which are beyond your control. You may have good people to work with, you may have good software, you may have technology, but if the external market keeps changing, for example, you mentioned the recessionary trend, because offshoring or outsourcing, as they call, depends on several other factors that the companies want to do certain business in a certain way. So it will depend. It will make sense when they will chase where the business can do very well. For example, a lot of voice business, I'm told, has moved to Philippines in the past few years. So, and like that, there will be me too players, and everybody wants to replicate the success of India. So all those factors are there. But one positive thing which I see is that Indian companies are trying to move up the value chain. I mean, we started with something called body shopping. In the sense, we'll physically send our guys to America. They'll work there in the companies, and less work will get happen here. But that is changing. The body shopping percentage is coming down. People are, a lot of work is getting offshore. Then we are doing more and more value-added work. People are doing engineering, design, and medical devices are being designed, and cars, different components of cars are being designed because today the manufacturing is heavily software driven. Everything has to be designed in a certain way. So things are getting designed. So we are moving into a different direction. But where India is lacking still is product development, where innovation really, that is the next limit of the next stage of innovation, that we will have to develop our own products, because the power of product is something completely different. I'll just give an example that the annual turnover of, say, top 10 to 15 Indian software giants, whom we call today, could be less than a quarter turnover of Apple. We may be a 120 billion industry, but we are still less than much way behind just one product company. So that is the power of products. So that's, I'm sure companies do realize that we need to develop more and products, more and more software products, and which can be used not just in the domestic market but globally. That's how you really become big. So, and of course the startup scene is there, and thanks to the changes like mobile technology, penetration of mobile, we have almost 1 billion mobile phones in India. So that is spurring a lot of innovation. We need to develop products which can work on Indian phones, Indian languages, under Indian conditions. As you mentioned about the low bandwidth, we have more phones per cell in India. So the technology that can work in, say, Europe or America is not going to work. That's why you have the problem of call drops and things like that. So we'll have to work around and innovate and develop products which are suitable to Indian markets, and hopefully for the other products, other countries like India, like whole of African continent is waiting for that's the next billion. What they say that the next billion phones would be got in Africa. So there are emerging markets where we need to go. But yeah, the last bit of innovation chain, or the next stage, is beginning to happen and big companies do realize, because in fact, of course, they're if you see quarter to quarter, they live from quarter to quarter, so the margins are going down, and people do realize, and big companies are setting up funds for startups and driving innovation either by buying up companies or having a separate mechanism, because startups need a different kind of environment, and at that for that I think the policy level also we need to do a few things.
Right. You know, Dinesh, in your book, you clearly outlined, several different layers of the outsourcing revolution in India. I mean, why just IT? I think we can safely say it was a boom because of the outsourcing, industry from overseas to India. And clearly, we have taken, as a nation, we've taken a lot of pride in our engineering and education system. uh, you know we've got the IITs, the NIT, and several other world renowned institutes. Do you see them really playing a strong role in this IT revolution?
Yeah, of course, the higher technical educations did play a big role in the initial, period till now. And in fact, when the IITs came up, the thought was we know that IITs were modeled after MIT. The committee which recommended setting up of higher technical educations did recommend a model of MIT, and we did. The IIT was set up. IIT Kanpur was set up with help from Ivy League institutions in America, and other IITs also we had international input. So they were really the best engineering schools, I would say. But what happened was when they came out of their institutions, some of them were too close to their parent countries or the engineering curriculum from where it was imported. So a lot of them went to America. They settled down there, either in academics or in companies, and when the time was right, they did come back, and a lot of them became mid-level or higher-level managers in their respective companies, and they became ambassadors of India. So IITs, although we could not get the full benefits in the 70s and 80s, it did benefit us in the later period, I would say. So it was kind of a brain circulation. Initially, it was thought that it's a brain drain, but then people started coming back and doing work in India. So that part of it is fairly known. But what is happening now is, of course, we have a huge number of engineering colleges. We produce more engineers today in India than America. But the question is of quality. IITs, of course, are there in one league. Then comes NITs. Then there's a whole lot of engineering colleges. And the quality, as industry would tell you, is not employable. So although we are adding a lot of numbers in terms of managers and engineers, but companies have to retrain them for doing for before they can absorb. So that I think is a major issue which we need to tackle. And in fact, some of the IITs, if you see, the newer ones, there are vacancies of a whole lot of faculty, and in fact, seats are also going up again in certain streams. So we need to really look at that. We can't be complacent that we have a good, higher technical education system, but we need to really work on that to improve quality, to improve, and we don't do much research. We need to produce. Even IT industry needs PhDs, so we need to increase that uptake of PhDs from IITs, from engineering colleges, from management schools, because all those high-end jobs are taken up by the PhDs. So we need to improve the output of engineers, which can work as the army of this industry. People can be absorbed straight away without much work. Secondly, we need to increase we need to focus on the higher end in terms of producing more PhDs, doing more engineering research. And third, I think that we often fail to notice that it is often cited that we have the advantage of an English-speaking manpower and workforce, but there have been certain surveys which have been done of the quality of English our engineering graduates can speak, and couple of years back, and they do it every year, which involves some say 30,000-40,000 engineers, and some of them could not even write the kind of English which is expected out of a high school student. So yes, that is an issue. We need to tackle all that. That's why people are moving the voice jobs to elsewhere, or even otherwise people need to write. Today is a world of communication. We need to write emails, we need to communicate. So we need to build our engineering workforce in different levels. So that's one area I think we really, as a country, as at the level of policy, at the level of industry, of course, they have been working, trying to work with education institutions, but we need to boost that. So numbers alone will not do. That advantage is slowly fitting away. There are any number of countries where you will find a better workforce and a smaller number, but we need to really build up the quality. That's the big challenge as I see.
Great. Dinesh, it's been a wonderful conversation with you, learning about all your research and the book. We've come to the end of the session. I'm seeing quite a few questions directed towards
Okay.
you on Twitter, and I would have loved to take a few. It's just that we've run out of time.
Okay.
Perhaps in your free time, you could respond to some of these people who are interacting with you on Twitter.
Sure, I'll do that. I think that will be my pleasure. And thanks for including me in this session. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Dinesh, and wish you all the best.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.